August 17, 1945, Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. The air hung thick with the smell of ash and disinfectant. In a makeshift medical tent erected among the ruins of what had once been a village schoolhouse, a young woman sat motionless on a wooden crate, her hands folded across the swell of her abdomen. Her name was Fumiko Nakamura, though the Americans would not learn this for several days. She was 23 years old. She was 7 months pregnant, and she was certain she was about to die. Outside, the sounds of reconstruction echoed across the shattered landscape. The mechanical grinding of bulldozers clearing rubble, the shouts of engineers directing traffic along newly carved roads, the distant hum of transport planes ferrying supplies from Guam. But inside the tent, there was only silence. Fumiko stared at the canvas wall, her breathing shallow, her mind racing through everything she had been told about the Americans, everything she had been taught to believe. The sun filtered through holes in the tent fabric, casting irregular patterns of light across the dirt floor. A medic entered, tall, thin, no older than 25, with rolled-up sleeves and a Red Cross armband wrapped tight around his left bicep. His name was Thomas McKinley, a farm boy from Iowa who had trained as a corpsman 2 years earlier and had seen more death in the Pacific than any young man should carry. He carried a canvas medical bag, worn and stained, and when he approached Fumiko, she flinched. She expected brutality. She expected violence. She expected the fate that Japanese propaganda had promised would befall any woman captured by the American enemy. Instead, Thomas McKinley knelt down beside her, set his bag gently on the ground, and spoke in broken, carefully practiced Japanese. "Anata wa anzen desu. You are safe." She did not believe him. To understand the terror that gripped Fumiko Nakamura in that medical tent, one must first understand the psychological architecture of total war, the machinery of fear that had been constructed, brick by brick, in the minds of Japanese civilians throughout the Pacific conflict. From 1942 onward, as American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, the Japanese government embarked on a comprehensive propaganda campaign designed to prepare its population for invasion. The message was consistent, relentless, and deliberate. Surrender meant annihilation. Newspapers published fabricated stories of American atrocities. Radio broadcasts described in graphic detail the alleged horrors awaiting Japanese women in American captivity. School children were taught that Americans were devils, kichiku-bei, subhuman monsters who would rape, torture, and murder without mercy. In Okinawa, where civilian casualties would ultimately exceed 100,000, this propaganda found fertile ground. As American forces closed in during the spring of 1945, Japanese military commanders distributed hand grenades to civilians, instructing families to commit collective suicide rather than face capture. On the cliffs of Marpi Point in Saipan, mothers threw their children into the sea before leaping after them. In the caves of Okinawa, entire families detonated explosives rather than emerge into American custody. The fear was real. The propaganda had worked. And Fumiko Nakamura, sitting in that medical tent with her unborn child pressing against her ribcage, carried that fear like a stone in her chest. She had not chosen to be there. Her husband, Hiroshi, had been conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1944, assigned to a supply unit stationed outside Naha. When the Americans landed on Okinawa's western beaches on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, Fumiko had fled south with thousands of other civilians, moving through the night, sleeping in caves, eating whatever roots and leaves could be scavenged from the scorched earth. She had watched friends die from artillery fire. She had seen children separated from their parents in the chaos of retreat. And when her water broke prematurely at 7 months, blood streaking down her legs as she crouched in a limestone cavern, she knew she could run no further. The Americans found her 3 days after the Emperor's surrender broadcast. She was unconscious, dehydrated, curled on her side in a shallow cave overlooking the East China Sea. A Marine patrol, 4 young men from California and Texas, carried her on a stretcher to the nearest aid station, where Thomas McKinley was processing an endless stream of wounded soldiers, liberated prisoners of war, and traumatized civilians. He had seen many things by then. He had treated Marines with limbs blown off by Japanese mines. He had held dying men as they called for their mothers. He had watched friends bleed out in his arms because there wasn't enough plasma, wasn't enough morphine, wasn't enough time. But when he saw Fumiko, unconscious, emaciated, her pregnant belly grotesquely swollen against her skeletal frame, something inside him shifted. He made a decision that would not appear in any military report, any official record, any citation for valor. He made her a promise. In the mythology of American warfare, the medic occupies a unique space. He is the healer on the battlefield, the man who runs toward gunfire while carrying no weapon, whose only defense is a red cross painted on white fabric. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 established protections for medical personnel, designating them as noncombatants whose sole purpose was the preservation of life. In practice, these protections were often ignored. Japanese soldiers routinely targeted American medics, viewing them as legitimate military assets, but the ideal persisted. The medic was supposed to be different. The medic was supposed to save everyone. Thomas McKinley took this ideal seriously. He had grown up on a 200-acre farm outside Des Moines, the second of 4 sons, raised by a Methodist mother who taught Sunday school and a father who believed in the gospel of hard work and fair dealing. When he enlisted in 1943, he requested assignment as a Navy corpsman specifically because he could not imagine killing another human being, even an enemy. His religious convictions were not absolute. He was no conscientious objector, but they were strong enough to shape his choices. He would serve, he would help, but he would not take life. The Pacific Theater tested that conviction daily. The Japanese military's refusal to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming force, created a theater of warfare characterized by desperate, close-quarters brutality. On islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, American Marines fought not against a conventional army, but against men who had been indoctrinated to view death in battle as the highest honor. Japanese soldiers hid in caves and launched nighttime infiltration attacks. They feigned surrender to detonate concealed grenades. They strapped explosives to their bodies and threw themselves beneath American tanks. In this environment, mercy became a complicated calculation. Medics like Thomas McKinley operated in the space between military necessity and human compassion, making split-second decisions about who could be saved, who should be saved, and what saving actually meant. He had treated wounded Japanese soldiers before, men pulled from caves after days without food or water, often missing limbs, often delirious from infection. The protocol was clear: stabilize, evacuate, interrogate if possible. But with Fumiko, the protocol felt inadequate. She was not a soldier. She was not even a combatant by the loosest definition. She was a pregnant civilian who had been caught in the machinery of total war, and when Thomas McKinley examined her that first day, checking her pulse, listening to her heartbeat with a stethoscope, feeling the taut drum of her abdomen, he understood that both she and her child were in immediate danger. She was severely malnourished. She was anemic. And she was terrified in a way that transcended language. When she finally regained consciousness and saw him leaning over her with a medical instrument, she began to scream. The scream was primal, raw, born from weeks of accumulated trauma and the certainty of imminent violence. Fumiko thrashed against the cot, trying to roll away, her hands instinctively covering her stomach. Thomas stepped back immediately, hands raised, speaking in that same broken Japanese he had practiced with a phrase book during the long voyage from Pearl Harbor. Anata wa anzen desu. Watashi wa isha desu. You are safe. I am a doctor. But she did not stop screaming. Other patients in the tent turned to look. A nurse, Lieutenant Mary O'Connor, a 30-year-old Army Nurse Corps officer from Boston, rushed over and placed herself between Fumiko and Thomas, speaking quickly in English. "She thinks you're going to hurt her. She thinks you're going to hurt the baby." Thomas looked at Mary, then back at Fumiko, whose screaming had dissolved into sobbing. He understood then that no amount of reassurance would penetrate the wall of fear that propaganda had built. Words were insufficient. What she needed was not promises but proof. So he made a different kind of promise, one that required no translation. He reached into his medical bag and withdrew a chocolate bar. It was a Hershey's tropical bar, specially formulated to withstand the Pacific heat, wrapped in brown paper with the distinctive silver logo. Thomas had been saving it, rationing his own supply of sweets, but he held it out now toward Fumiko with both hands like an offering. She stared at it, confused. He unwrapped one end, broke off a square, and ate it himself to demonstrate it was not poisoned. Then he broke off another piece and extended it toward her again. For a long moment she did not move. The sobbing had stopped. She looked at the chocolate, then at Thomas's face, then at Mary O'Connor, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, hesitantly, Fumiko reached out and took the chocolate. She brought it to her lips. She tasted it, and for the first time in weeks she tasted something that was not bitterness, not fear, not the metallic tang of survival. She tasted sweetness. It was a small thing, a single square of chocolate, but in that moment it became the first crack in the wall. The Hershey's Tropical Bar was born from necessity. In 1937, as European tensions escalated and the possibility of American military involvement grew more likely, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps approached the Hershey Company with an unusual request: develop a chocolate bar that could survive extreme temperatures, provide high caloric content, and boost morale among troops stationed in hostile environments. The result was the D ration, a 4-ounce bar containing approximately 600 calories, made from chocolate, sugar, skim milk powder, cocoa butter, oat flour, and vanillin. It was designed, in the words of Army specifications, to taste only slightly better than a boiled potato, so that soldiers would not consume it as a snack but reserve it for emergencies. By 1945, Hershey had produced more than 3 billion D ration bars. They were distributed to soldiers across every theater of war: Europe, North Africa, the Pacific. And while they were intended purely as field rations, they became something more. To American soldiers, the chocolate bar was a tangible link to home, a reminder of normalcy in the midst of chaos. But to civilians in occupied territories, to prisoners of war, to refugees and survivors, American chocolate became a symbol of something larger: abundance. The United States in 1945 was a nation of extraordinary industrial capacity. While European cities lay in ruins and Asian populations faced starvation, American factories produced not only the weapons of war but the small comforts that sustained morale. Chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, chewing gum. These were the minor luxuries that American soldiers carried in their packs, distributed casually, often given away without a second thought. To recipients who had lived through years of rationing, blockade, and deprivation, these gifts were revelatory. When Fumiko Nakamura tasted that chocolate bar in Thomas McKinley's medical tent, she was tasting the industrial output of a nation that could afford to send candy bars to its soldiers in the field. She was tasting a country that had not been bombed, had not been starved, had not been forced to choose between surrender and suicide. And though she could not articulate it in that moment, she was beginning to understand that everything she had been told about the Americans might be wrong. Over the following days, as Thomas worked to stabilize her condition, the chocolate bar became a ritual. Each morning he would bring her a square, carefully broken from the bar he kept in his medical bag. He would sit beside her cot, never too close, always respecting her space, and he would eat a piece himself before offering her one. It was a small gesture, but it established trust. Slowly, incrementally, Fumiko began to relax in his presence. She remained terrified. She still flinched when male soldiers walked past the tent. She still covered her stomach protectively whenever anyone approached. But with Thomas, she began to understand that she was not in immediate danger, and that understanding allowed him to begin the real work of keeping her alive. The medical challenges were severe. Fumiko was suffering from acute malnutrition, her body cannibalizing its own muscle mass to sustain the pregnancy. Her blood pressure was dangerously low. She showed signs of anemia, dehydration, and early-stage infections that, if left untreated, could lead to sepsis. Under normal circumstances, she would have been evacuated immediately to a field hospital with obstetric facilities. But in August 1945, nothing about Okinawa was normal. The battle for Okinawa had officially ended on June 22, but the island remained a landscape of devastation. Tens of thousands of civilians had been displaced. Infrastructure was destroyed. Medical resources were stretched impossibly thin, prioritized for American casualties, and then, secondarily, for Japanese prisoners of war who might provide intelligence value. Pregnant civilian women ranked low on the triage list. There were simply too many people who needed help, and not enough doctors, nurses, or supplies to provide it. Thomas McKinley understood this calculus. He also chose to ignore it. Using his limited authority as a senior corpsman, he requisitioned additional rations for Fumiko from the officers' mess: canned vegetables, powdered eggs, condensed milk. He convinced a sympathetic supply sergeant to lose a case of vitamin supplements in the medical tent's inventory. He spent his off-duty hours sitting beside her cot, monitoring her vital signs, adjusting her fluid intake, watching for any signs of premature labor. And when Lieutenant O'Connor asked him why he was dedicating so much time to one patient, he gave an answer that would later be recorded in her personal diary. Because she's terrified and she's pregnant, and if we can't take care of someone like her, then what the hell are we fighting for? It was not an official justification. It would not appear in any after-action report, but it reflected a fundamental tension in American conduct during the Pacific War, the gap between the brutality of combat and the ideals that supposedly motivated it. The United States had entered World War II, in theory, to defend freedom and democracy against totalitarian aggression. But in practice, the war in the Pacific had devolved into a race war, characterized by mutual atrocities, dehumanization, and a level of savagery that shocked even hardened combat veterans. American propaganda portrayed Japanese soldiers as subhuman, as vermin to be exterminated. Japanese propaganda did the same to Americans. Prisoners were tortured and executed on both sides. Civilians were killed in strategic bombing campaigns that deliberately targeted population centers. And in this environment of total war, the idea of mercy, of compassion, of treating an enemy civilian with basic human dignity became almost subversive. Thomas McKinley's promise to Fumiko Nakamura was, in its own way, an act of rebellion. He was choosing to see her not as a member of the enemy population, but as a pregnant woman in desperate need of care. And in making that choice, he was asserting a version of American identity that stood in stark contrast to the propaganda both sides had promulgated. By the third week of August, Fumiko had gained enough strength to sit up without assistance. Her color had improved. The swelling in her ankles had diminished. Most importantly, she had begun to speak. Her English was limited, a few words learned in school before the war, but she and Thomas developed a hybrid communication system using gestures, drawings, and the phrase book he consulted religiously. She told him, haltingly, about her husband, about the cave where she had hidden, about her fear that her baby would be born into a world where no safety existed. Thomas listened. He did not try to argue with her fear or minimize it. Instead, he told her about Iowa, about farms and cornfields, about a place where people worried about rain and harvest rather than bombs and bullets. He showed her a photograph he carried in his wallet, his parents standing in front of their farmhouse, smiling, his mother holding a basket of tomatoes. Fumiko studied the photograph for a long time, trying to reconcile the image with everything she had been taught about American barbarians. The contradiction was profound. How could people who grew tomatoes and smiled in photographs be the same people who dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? How could a soldier who brought her chocolate every morning be part of an army that had killed so many Japanese civilians? The cognitive dissonance was painful, destabilizing. Everything Fumiko had believed about the war, about the enemy, about her own government's justifications for the conflict, was beginning to fracture. This fracture was not unique to Fumiko. Across Okinawa, Japanese civilians were experiencing similar moments of revelation. They had been told that Americans would kill them on sight. Instead, they found themselves in refugee camps where they received food, medical care, and shelter. They had been promised that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. Instead, they discovered that American soldiers often treated them with surprising gentleness. Not always, not universally, but often enough to create doubt. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, a Marine who fought on Okinawa and later wrote one of the war's most harrowing memoirs, described watching American troops share their rations with starving Japanese children. He wrote, "It was hard to hate civilians who were so obviously victims of their own government's fanaticism. We gave them food, we gave them water, and we tried to explain in broken Japanese and hand gestures that they didn't need to be afraid anymore." But fear, once embedded, is difficult to extract. Fumiko's trust in Thomas McKinley grew incrementally, built on the foundation of repeated small kindnesses, the daily chocolate, the careful medical examinations, the way he always asked permission before touching her, the gentle tone of his voice even when she could not understand his words. Yet she remained deeply afraid of other American soldiers, particularly the combat Marines who passed through the medical tent with the hard, distant expressions of men who had seen too much death. Lieutenant O'Connor understood this fear and worked to create a protective bubble around Fumiko. She assigned a female nurse to monitor Fumiko during the hours when Thomas was off duty. She screened visitors to the medical tent, turning away curious soldiers who wanted to see the pregnant Jap. And when a chaplain, Captain Robert Harrison, a Catholic priest from Philadelphia, offered to provide pastoral care, Mary carefully explained that religious overtures might be counterproductive given Fumiko's trauma and cultural background. But Captain Harrison was persistent. He had been in the Pacific for 18 months, had administered last rites to dying Marines, had buried friends in hastily dug graves marked with wooden crosses. And he had also seen the aftermath of Japanese suicide cliffs, the bodies of mothers and children washed up on beaches, the horrific price of propaganda-fueled fear. He told Mary, simply to pray for Fumiko and her child, not to convert or evangelize, but to acknowledge their humanity in the presence of God. Mary reluctantly agreed, stipulating that the chaplain could pray silently at the edge of the tent but could not approach Fumiko directly. And so Captain Harrison came, each evening at sunset, and knelt in the corner of the medical tent with his rosary, his lips moving soundlessly. Fumiko watched him at first with suspicion, then with curiosity, and finally with a kind of puzzled acceptance. She did not understand what he was doing, but she recognized the posture of prayer, the universality of spiritual supplication. And in that recognition, another small crack appeared in the wall. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese government signed the formal instruments of surrender, officially ending World War II. The news reached Okinawa within hours, transmitted via radio across the thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. In the medical tent where Fumiko lay, Thomas McKinley heard the announcement and felt a wave of relief so profound it brought tears to his eyes. The war was over. He had survived. And perhaps most importantly, the killing had stopped. But for Fumiko, the announcement brought not relief but a new kind of terror. With the war officially ended, the status of Japanese civilians in American custody became uncertain. Would they be repatriated? Would they be charged as enemy collaborators? Would families be reunited or permanently separated? The administrative machinery of occupation was just beginning to grind into motion, and no one could answer these questions with any certainty. Thomas tried to reassure her. He explained through the phrase book and gestures that she would be taken care of, that the baby would be delivered safely, that she would not be abandoned. But Fumiko had learned not to trust promises from governments, and the United States government was now the occupying power in her homeland. She had no legal status, no documentation, no way to advocate for herself. She was entirely dependent on the goodwill of strangers. The goodwill, however, proved more durable than she had expected. In mid-September, as Fumiko entered her 8th month of pregnancy, Thomas arranged for her transfer to a larger field hospital that had been established in a partially restored school building near Naha. The facility had actual beds, obstetric equipment, and a Navy doctor, Lieutenant Commander James Whitaker, who specialized in high-risk pregnancies. Thomas accompanied Fumiko in the ambulance, holding her hand as they drove through the devastated landscape, past burned-out tanks and shattered buildings and mass graves marked with temporary wooden markers. At the field hospital, Lieutenant Commander Whitaker examined Fumiko thoroughly and delivered his assessment in blunt medical terms. The pregnancy had progressed despite severe maternal malnutrition, but the child was small and likely premature by several weeks. Natural delivery was possible but risky. If complications arose, he might need to perform a cesarean section under less than ideal conditions. He recommended waiting as long as possible to allow the child to develop further, but he made no promises about outcomes. Thomas translated as much as he could, watching Fumiko's face as she absorbed the information. She asked, in halting English, if her baby would live. Lieutenant Commander Whitaker looked at her for a long moment, then answered with careful honesty. "I don't know, but I promise you this. We will do everything in our power to make sure both of you survive." It was the same promise Thomas had made weeks earlier, but coming from a doctor in a real hospital, it carried different weight. Fumiko nodded slowly, placed both hands on her swollen belly, and said in Japanese, "Wange shimasu, please." The baby came on September 28, 1945, 3 weeks before the due date estimated by Lieutenant Commander Whitaker. Labor began in the early morning hours, marked by sharp contractions that woke Fumiko from restless sleep. A nurse summoned Whitaker immediately, and within minutes the hospital's small obstetric ward transformed into organized chaos. Thomas McKinley, who had been sleeping in the corpsmen's barracks 100 yards away, was roused by a runner and arrived breathless, still pulling on his shirt. He found Fumiko in active labor, her face contorted with pain, gripping the metal rails of the hospital bed. Lieutenant Commander Whitaker was scrubbing his hands, calling out instructions to the nurses, preparing for a delivery that would test every skill he had learned in medical school and refined through years of wartime emergency medicine. Thomas asked if he could stay, if he could be present for the birth, and Whitaker hesitated only briefly before nodding. "She trusts you," the doctor said. "That might matter." Labor lasted 6 hours. Fumiko did not scream. She had been taught that Japanese women endure suffering silently, but her breathing grew ragged, her knuckles white from gripping the bed rails. Thomas stood beside her, offering water, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, speaking quietly in broken Japanese, telling her she was strong, she was brave, the baby was coming, everything would be all right. He did not know if everything would be all right. He was not a doctor. He had no specialized training in obstetrics, but he had made a promise, and he intended to keep it through sheer force of will if necessary. At 11:47 a.m., Fumiko's son was born. He emerged small and blue, not breathing, the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck. Lieutenant Commander Whitaker moved with practiced speed, clearing the airway, unwrapping the cord, stimulating the infant's chest. For 10 seconds, an eternity compressed into heartbeats, there was no sound. Then the baby gasped, coughed, and began to cry. A thin, reedy wail that filled the room like a declaration. Fumiko began to sob. Thomas felt his own eyes fill with tears. One of the nurses, a young woman from Kansas who had volunteered for the Army Nurse Corps straight out of nursing school, laughed with pure relief. And Lieutenant Commander Whitaker, who had delivered hundreds of bobbies in his career, allowed himself a rare smile. "He's a fighter," the doctor said, placing the infant on Fumiko's chest. "Small, but a fighter." The baby weighed 4 pounds, 3 ounces. His lungs were underdeveloped, his body temperature unstable. Under normal circumstances, he would have been placed in an incubator, monitored constantly, given supplemental oxygen and specialized care. But this was not a hospital in Boston or San Francisco. This was a field hospital on Okinawa, and resources were limited. So Lieutenant Commander Whitaker improvised. He wrapped the infant in layers of blankets to maintain body heat. He instructed the nurses to feed him with an eyedropper every 2 hours. And he assigned Thomas McKinley as the baby's primary caretaker, reasoning that the corpsman's commitment to the child's survival was the closest thing they had to specialized neonatal care. For the next 3 weeks, Thomas barely slept. He monitored the baby's breathing, checked his temperature, administered feedings with meticulous precision. When the infant's temperature dropped dangerously low one night, Thomas held him against his own chest for 4 hours, using his body heat to stabilize the child. When the baby developed jaundice, Thomas positioned his crib near a window where sunlight could provide natural phototherapy. And when Fumiko, still weak from delivery and malnourished despite weeks of supplemental feeding, struggled to produce enough breast milk, Thomas requisitioned powdered formula from the hospital's limited supplies and mixed it according to strict ratios, testing every batch to ensure proper concentration. The baby survived. Against odds that any rational medical assessment would have considered poor, he survived. And in surviving, he became a symbol, not just for Fumiko and Thomas, but for everyone in that field hospital who had witnessed his birth. He represented the possibility of life emerging from catastrophe, of hope persisting through trauma, of human connection transcending the ideological divisions that had led to war. Fumiko named him Akira, meaning bright or clear. It was a name that looked forward, not back. A name for a child who would grow up in a world that was, perhaps, different from the one his mother had known. The transformation in Fumiko's worldview did not happen suddenly. It was not a conversion experience, a dramatic moment of revelation. Instead, it accumulated gradually, built from hundreds of small interactions that contradicted everything she had been taught. Thomas McKinley's chocolate bars, Lieutenant Commander Whitaker's medical expertise applied without prejudice, the nurses who tended to her with professional care, the supply sergeants who procured baby formula and blankets, the chaplain who prayed silently in the corner. Each act of basic human decency chipped away at the propaganda that had painted Americans as monsters. By October 1945, as the American occupation of Japan began in earnest, Fumiko had begun to ask questions. She asked Thomas why Americans had fought the war. She asked if it was true that Japan had attacked first at Pearl Harbor. She asked about democracy, about voting, about the strange American idea that ordinary people could choose their own leaders. Her questions were naive, filtered through limited English and profound cultural differences, but they reflected genuine curiosity. Thomas did his best to answer, though he often felt inadequate to the task. He was a farm boy from Iowa, not a political philosopher. He had enlisted because his country had been attacked, had served because he believed in helping others, but he had never developed a sophisticated understanding of American foreign policy or democratic theory. So he answered her questions with simple, concrete examples. In America, he told her, people could criticize the government without being arrested. In America, women could vote, could own property, could make their own choices. In America, no one would force you to commit suicide rather than surrender. These explanations were incomplete, sometimes painfully simplistic. They elided the reality of racial segregation in the American South, the internment of Japanese Americans during the war, the many ways that American democracy fell short of its ideals. but they contained a kernel of truth that resonated with Fumiko's experience. She had lived under a government that had demanded absolute obedience, that had sent her husband to war, that had told her she must die rather than fall into enemy hands. And now she was alive, holding her infant son, cared for by that same enemy who had turned out not to be an enemy at all. The cognitive dissonance was profound and destabilizing. Everything she had believed about her own government's justifications for the war began to unravel. If the Americans were not barbarians, then why had Japan fought so desperately? If surrender was not worse than death, then why had so many civilians killed themselves and their children? The answers to these questions were complex, rooted in decades of militarism, nationalism, and cultural indoctrination. But Fumiko did not have access to that historical context. She had only her own experience, her own observations, and the growing realization that she had been lied to. This realization created a kind of grief. She grieved for her husband, who she now learned had been killed defending Naha in May 1945. His body never recovered. She grieved for the friends who had thrown themselves from cliffs rather than face capture. She grieved for the country she had believed in, the narrative of noble sacrifice that had sustained her through years of war. And in that grief, she began to understand that wars are not fought between monsters and heroes. They are fought between human beings who have been convinced that the other side is not human. Thomas McKinley understood this too, though he would not articulate it clearly until many years later. In taking care of Fumiko and Akira, he was not performing an act of charity. He was not saving the enemy. He was simply recognizing that the labels, American, Japanese, ally, enemy, were less important than the fundamental fact of shared humanity. Fumiko was a person. Akira was a child, and both deserved to live. It was not a revolutionary insight, but in the context of total war, it felt revolutionary, and it would shape both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. In November 1945, as the occupation authorities began processing Japanese civilians for repatriation or resettlement, Fumiko faced an uncertain future. Her husband was dead. Her parents had been killed in the Battle of Okinawa. She had no extended family, no home to return to, no means of supporting herself and her infant son. Under normal circumstances, she would have been sent to a refugee camp to await assignment to one of the resettlement programs being organized by the American administration. But Lieutenant Commander Whitaker, who had taken a personal interest in her case, proposed an alternative. The American occupation forces were establishing orphanages and medical facilities across Japan, staffed partly by Japanese civilians who could serve as interpreters, nurses' aides, and administrators. Fumiko's experience in the field hospital, combined with her basic English and her obvious intelligence, made her a potential candidate for employment. Whitaker wrote a letter of recommendation describing her character, her resilience, and her potential value as a bridge between American medical personnel and Japanese civilians. The letter was forwarded to the occupation headquarters in Tokyo, where it was reviewed by a bureaucrat who, in a moment of administrative mercy, approved Fumiko's application for employment as a hospital aide. It was not a glamorous position. It paid subsistence wages, but it provided housing, food, and most importantly, a future. Fumiko would work at a newly established clinic in Naha, assisting American and Japanese medical personnel in treating civilians injured during the war or suffering from malnutrition and disease. Akira would be cared for in the clinic's nursery during her shifts, and slowly, incrementally, she would begin to rebuild a life from the ruins of the old one. Thomas McKinley learned of this arrangement 2 days before his unit was scheduled to ship out from Okinawa. He visited Fumiko at the clinic, bringing one final gift, a full box of chocolate bars, carefully wrapped and tied with string. She accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, bowing deeply in the traditional Japanese gesture of profound gratitude. Thomas bowed back awkwardly, unsure of the proper etiquette, and then he said in his broken but sincere Japanese, "Akira Watsu. Anata Motsuya, Akira is strong, you are strong too. Fumiko nodded, unable to speak. She wanted to tell him that he had saved her life, that he had given her son a chance to live, that he had shown her a different vision of what human beings could be to one another. But the words would not come, blocked by emotion and the limitations of language. So instead, she simply said, "Arigato gozaimasu," thank you. It was inadequate. No words could have been adequate. But Thomas understood. He smiled, touched Akira's head gently, and then walked out of the clinic into the bright November sunlight. 3 days later, he was on a transport ship headed back to California, carrying memories of a war he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. The story of Fumiko Nakamura and Thomas McKinley did not end with his departure from Okinawa. It continued in the letters they exchanged over the following years, stilted, translated, but genuine efforts to maintain a connection that had formed under extraordinary circumstances. Thomas returned to Iowa, used the GI Bill to attend college, became a teacher, married, raised 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war, but he kept Fumiko's letters in a drawer in his desk, and occasionally he would take them out and read them, remembering. Fumiko remained in Okinawa, working at the clinic, raising Akira, slowly learning to trust in a future that had once seemed impossible. She remarried in 1952 to a Japanese carpenter who was helping rebuild Naha. She had 2 more children. She taught Akira about his birth, about the American medic who had made a promise and kept it, about the chocolate bars that had represented a different kind of world. And when Akira grew old enough to understand, she told him that the war had been wrong, that the propaganda had been lies, that human beings were capable of both.